very pleased to have with us today Brooke Hecht, the president of the Center of Humans and Nature. That organization was founded by the late Strawn Donnelly to explore and promote the idea that human beings, individually and collectively, have moral and civic responsibilities to natural ecosystems. Appropriate, I think, that Brooke is here today. Brooke's joined by our own Aubrey Streit Krug, and I'm very much looking forward to their conversation.
Good morning. So, I'm Aubrey. Brooke and I look alike.
I'm Brooke.
We are really happy to be here, and Brooke and I are going to engage in some conversation and in some interaction with you this morning. I thought we might just begin, Brooke, by maybe having you introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to the Center for Humans and Nature.
I guess I should have expected that question first. So when I graduated with my PhD in ecology and had the sense that science was what we needed, which it is, I also found that people weren't necessarily paying attention to data on climate change and other things, and I was looking for a think tank where people brought together ideas from different perspectives, ecology, philosophy, religion, and so on, and everyone kept saying, well, there isn't any place like that. But I kept asking and asking for this place, and eventually I found Strawn Donnelly, who was a dear, dear friend of Wes, so I met Wes almost right away. And Strawn had worked for a bioethics think tank in New York, and when I say that, everyone knows what that is. You know, it's biomedical ethics, because you know when you get into medical situations, there are ethical and moral dimensions to consider. But he said to his board, what about the moral dimensions of the rest of our relationships with each other and with the more than human world? And his board kind of looked quizzically, as most people do now when they hear about the Center for Humans and Nature. Said, no, we're going to stick to bioethics. And Strawn said, I'm going to take that bigger. Let's look at the moral dimensions of these relationships and create an idea hub where people coming from different academic disciplines, different faith or perspectives or traditions, different life experiences can bring their wisdom to the challenges that we face ahead. So I've been lucky to be a part of that for about 10 years now. Yeah.
That's wonderful. I met Brooke last year in relationship to an essay that I wrote in response to an ongoing series that they have where the Center for Humans and Nature asks big questions and invites people from different backgrounds to ask them and to answer them and to have dialogue around them. So I wondered, Brooke, if you could talk a little bit about the big questions work, the questions for a resilient future work, what that looks like, and then maybe we can talk in particular about the question that we've been discussing and that your work is really animated by right now.
Yeah, I think just about the big questions work, you can go online and see it, you can respond yourself, you can read any of the questions. I mean, they range from things like, what does it mean to be human, to what should we do with our roads infrastructure? You know, we kind of cross the gamut there. One of our questions that's about to launch is, what does it mean to be a farmer in the 21st century? So please bring your responses, and I'm sure you would all enjoy reading what Fred, among others, have to say. You're not late on your deadline. You still have a little time. Good. But the question that Aubrey was invited to respond to and where we met is a question that our colleague John Hausdorfer began to explore. And the question is, what kind of ancestor do you want to be? I know this isn't fair for me to turn it on the panel, but do you want to share some of your response? Because yours is already published, and it's really beautiful.
Thank you. Whatever I say will not be as beautiful as whatever I wrote in the essay, but I think it's fair. This is not an interview, it's a conversation. So the essay that I wrote in response to what kind of ancestor do you want to be was the answer grounded. And I thought about what it means to be a willing participant in the living work of the ground, and what it means to become aware of the absence of that groundedness in one's life. And for me, that moment happened in something I recount in the essay, sitting in a basement classroom when I realized the roots that had been removed from that classroom at a land-grant university to make a learning space. And I started to think about and imagine what the space I was inhabiting, where that ground was. And that launched me into thinking more about the long term. And I think that this question is helpful and challenging and unsettling. And it's something that with Ecosphere studies is something we think about a lot. And with the Land Institute, what does it mean to think in these long-term ways? What does it mean to think generations back and to think generations ahead? So yesterday, this is where our conversation has been going about trying to do that imaginative work of thinking ahead and also grappling with what that brings up for us emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. And maybe, Brooke, I'll turn it back to you and ask a little bit about maybe some of the other essays in the series that have struck with you, and some of the other essays that might be collected in the book. There's a book version of this question, what kind of ancestor do you want to be, that Brooke and John Hausdorff are editing. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that project and some of the other voices that have come up.
Yeah, I think first about the project, I think my own response as an editor is similar to something that we had yesterday when you did the prompt. You said, think ahead 7 generations, as we walked in your beautiful area.
Hedge
there,
fire
the hedge
circle,
fire
yeah.
circle, thank you. And someone I spoke with afterwards said, well, when that question was asked, to think ahead and to think what this person in the 7th generation might say to us, I froze. This is what the person said. And I will confess now, even though I didn't at the time, that that's the experience I've also had as an editor. Everyone said, well, where's your piece on what kind of ancestor you want to be? And I think I froze. It's very difficult to think about that question and what that means for right now. To think about, as I was talking with Aubrey yesterday, about some of my own recent ancestors and what that means. And I had trouble because I'm not accustomed to it, to even imagine 7 generations forward. And I sort of used the hay bales to help me. I went out and I sort of like, okay, well, here are 7 hay bales, and I can see my 2 daughters. I can see their children. I can sort of imagine I can imagine their grandchildren, but as I went down, even with the hay bales, I had a hard time imagining these 7 generations. It takes training, I think, and practice that we need to cultivate, and even that 7th hay bale was kind of separated off, and there was a break that felt important to me. Same thing 7 generations back. I don't know who my ancestors are. I can't even claim to have lived for hundreds of years in the land where I live now. So there's a feeling of brokenness with some of those traditions and ceremonies that I can only sort of imagine that were ancient, that I no longer know. So then what kind of ancestor do I want to be? I think one of the good things about the center, and at least for me, is that we try to offer the space for people to carry questions, big questions, where you don't just have to kind of answer right away, but know that this is a question that's a lifetime to consider.
Yeah, and I think that some of those questions that we live with, part of the training and the practice is not jumping into some other people's or someone else's answer and glomming onto it, appropriating it, finding comfort in the quick answer. There has to be a kind of willingness to live in that space of discomfort or living with the questions. That's so important, but it also, for me, is a reminder about how these questions are not individual. They are social and communal, and to have a space at the Center for Humans and Nature, at the Land Institute, in this barn, in the Hedgefire Circle, to come together and to be with other people who are asking those questions and having those questions and wanting to talk about them. I just spoke with someone who was coming out of the exercise yesterday and has still been thinking about it and said, I really feel a desire and a need to have conversation to help me begin to process this. I immediately responded with discomfort, and I keep thinking about it. And I think that if there's been any burrs or stickers planted in your mind or seeds of ideas that are starting to grow in ways that you don't know where it's headed or can't predict, that to me is a beautiful outcome of this type of work. But I recognize that it's not something that any human can be asked to do alone. So the community aspect just seems so incredibly important to me. And to think about ancestral lineages and past and future as part of community as well, I think is helpful.
I'm glad we found you, or you found me. Either way, we're sister organizations in this work.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, just to keep going with the ancestor question a little bit more, how has that question led you into being able to articulate more of your own purpose for what you want the book to do, for readers, or the work that you see yourself doing in inviting other people into this process of living inquiry, which for those of you who haven't read Frog Pond Philosophy yet, it's over in the bookstore, and as Rachel mentioned, we'll talk about it more next year. It is a book that is very much about inquiry and that living embodiment of it that Strawn offered and that continues to live on, these questions that he's gifted us. And so I'm wondering, with this book project, how will this book and how will this question live in the world, and how has that helped you think about your role as an editor, as a leader of an organization?
Well, I think pretty quickly the question just gets personal. I mean, I guess it's confronting that way, and it immediately then makes me want to tell my own story and hear others' story. I thought about it a lot yesterday, and this is something we talked about yesterday. I've not shared in a public forum, but we talked about the Manhattan Project, and my grandfather was on the Manhattan Project. He worked on the case. And my mother lived there. My uncle was born there, and I know, and Wes. Oh, I love you, Aubrey. And Wes said, we need to turn this around. Those who have been focused on the Manhattan Project and had that kind of budget. We now need, the think tanks to focus on these big questions. And I was like, oh, Wes, did you know I'm your poster child? And if you can help me get the budget of the Manhattan Project for the center, that would be great. Okay. But, the terrifying thing I think of is my mother, who after my grandfather worked on the case and, the bombs went off and the project was over. She then went home and went to school and went to hide under her own desk when the calls came. So this terror was unleashed on everyone. And then when she grew up, she got married, and of course married a smart scientist, just like her father, my father, a geophysicist who was an executive of a mining company. And they traveled a lot, and especially when I was in middle school, and they would come home, and having traveled all over the world, and my mother would say, I was the first white woman in this town. And I was proud. I was so proud. They were explorers. They were smart. They were brave. They did things that no other people had done before. But when I got to high school and started asking more big questions and started saying, wait a second, what's happening there now that you're the first white person? So you can imagine there was some lively dinner table conversation at my house. And I do remember one question back to me, which was, who are you to say who should be there? Who are you to say how things should evolve? And the thought that went through my teenage mind was, that is a question that's worth carrying for my life. That is a question to carry to the future. And so these are the things that I consider when I think about what kind of ancestor I want to be. Beyond my grandparents and my parents, who's a little bit of a story I've told, I don't know much. I don't remember much. I don't have a ceremony. I don't have a connection to a land. I don't have a connection to a place. What can I rediscover? Who can we be? I just have to carry it.
Can you speak briefly about some of the words of wisdom that you've been given through the work of the Center for Humans and Nature, through some of the other contributors that you've been working with for the Ancestor book, who have not given you answers to that question, but have given you words of beauty or advice to hold on to that help you carry that question with you?
Yeah, I just came back last weekend from California. I had a beautiful experience with the Winnemem-Wintu tribe and their run for salmon. I had the chance to interview Colleen Sisk, their chief, for this book. And this tribe is not recognized by the federal government because their homelands are behind and underneath the Shasta Dam. So, of course, they cannot be recognized. That would cause some problems for the government at this point. But with the dam, these are the salmon people. They speak for the salmon. They have a voice for the salmon. But the salmon can't cross Shasta Dam. And importantly, where the salmon need to go are up their sacred mountain and to their sacred spring. And so they walk. They have a prayer, and they walk for 2 weeks, the pilgrimage route from the bay in San Francisco, where the salmon, the ancient salmon, used to run. And she told me that people now come to this sacred spring, and they know that it's sacred, but they put crystals there, and they bring the ashes of their loved ones. And she told me as an aside, the ashes of those loved ones will be wandering forever. This isn't where you put your dead. But it comes back to this question of confusion and appropriation and what are the instructions and where do we get our wisdom and how do we do it? She said, they have the right to do that. They have the right to put their ashes in there. And these questions then of rights and responsibilities become very tricky. But for her wisdom and role as an ancestor is clear. She speaks for the salmon. She will walk for the salmon. She will call them home until they get there, and it's a beautiful thing.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
One of the things that came up in the exercise yesterday, and that has come up over again, I imagine, about these big questions, and it's a question people often ask to philosophers and teachers, is about the trade-offs, the tension, the friction that comes from feeling a need to have space and time and to move more slowly and deliberately through this work of living inquiry, to move at a pace that's more akin to that of the land, of seasonality, but at the same time feeling what I see in many people that I work with and feel myself often, a feeling of desperation, urgency, fear about how quickly change needs to happen or how quickly I need to change, and those run into each other a lot. And so I wondered if you could speak a little bit to that, about these different paces of time and scales of time that this work of inquiry calls us into, and some of the ways in which these questions about breaks in time or confusion or needing things to unfold feels pressured or doesn't to you.
I have a feeling from just the beauty and thoughtfulness of your question that you have as much to say on that as I do. Probably more. The thing that comes to mind for me actually is thinking about Wes and milling about. Wes is, having been the dear friend of Strawn, I've known him for a while now. I don't think of him as milling about. He's like purposeful and has so much to do and is always doing it, and it's, nonstop, and yet there's this wisdom in milling about, in stopping, in pausing. And you invited us to do that yesterday. So I'm going to turn it back to you as you tell us maybe more of why you did that and what your thoughts are.
Well, the phrase milling about is not one that I hear Wes use a lot, but it's something that Winona LaDuke wrote about in her contribution to the What Kind of Ancestor Do You Want to Be series. And she mentioned Wes and mentioned this vision of a world in which people have time to mill about. And I think of Prairie Festival as a time where we mill. And that seems so important to me. And I think that the way that I address, I don't know how to answer any prescription for how other people deal with this in their lives, but for me, I just have come to recognize that feeling of tension, and to be of a feeling pressed for time, but wanting the space for time, to feel that, to name that tension not as being torn apart, but as a kind of pressure that in itself can be generative, that can make something. So to turn the story I was telling about, this is going to tear me apart, into a story about this is the kind of struggle and sorrow that can mold my life in a positive way, and in a way that makes an actual contribution. That is what keeps me milling and moving, even on days when it seems like there is no space for milling. Yeah. So, yeah.
That it just makes me think of another piece of wisdom that was shared by one of the other contributors to the book, and who's also online, Ilarion Merkuliev, who's a spiritual leader of the people from the Aleutian Islands for the last 10,000 or more years. But he urges us to place our attention on the beauty, the love, the positive things that we want to see. We spent time in our circle yesterday doing this exercise where there was sadness and there was blame, whether it was on capitalism or certain aspects of our system and so on. And his teaching is that if we do focus on that and not on the beauty that we want to see, we'll still get lost and circulate in this negative place. So I think that's important to remember on where we keep our vision. Making the land beautiful again. That fills my heart with joy and makes me want to go forward, whereas thinking about capitalism makes me want to cry.
Yeah, the joy, the grief, and holding both of those, moving forward. One of the things that we talked about was how in this session we wanted to not only have our voices be present, but especially because of what we see our work as making a space for others and listening. I think we're both here because we want to listen to each other and not talk, and maybe there's a place for that in this room as well, and that holding the space. So in a weekend that is a container for time, we also wanted to use this space deliberately to be a container for thinking about this question, about what kind of ancestor do you want to be. I don't know if you want to introduce this, Brooke, this exercise.
Sure. We wanted to just invite you to find someone you don't know, and we just do a pairing, and I think you're in charge of time, so you can tell us how long. Yeah. But to just do a pairing with someone you don't know and consider the question, either what kind of ancestor you want to be, or think of the prompt from yesterday, if you didn't get to participate, on what might someone from 7 generations from now say to you. What do you hear? What do you need to hear?
So we're going to ask you not to mill about. No milling. But we're going to ask you to just reflect and speak with the person sitting next to you. And we're going to come back, our attention up here in 5 minutes. And then we will have a little bit more discussion and also start inviting questions from the audience at that time. So what kind of ancestor do you want to be? Okay, friends, we're going to come back together now. I'll let you say that last brilliant thing. I'm feeling so much solidarity with Rachel and the work that she does to bring us together. And an appreciation for her ability to do it. So thank you, Rachel. I'm going to ask now, thank you so much.
Yeah. And can I just say I'm feeling solidarity with all of you for taking on this difficult question. I just look out and my heart is full of gratitude for all of you for doing that.
As you were talking, Brooke and I were speaking, and we were talking about how this work and this book project itself is really designed to invite people into this. So the idea of reading other people's answers or hearing them is not so much that you will find a ready-made answer, but instead that you will feel called into participation into this process of inquiry that we all share, and that there is so much joy to be found in feeling solidarity and knowing that you're together with other people and living those questions. So in these last few moments that we have together, Brooke and I would like to invite not responses so much. I hope that the responses you began to share with each other to this question are ones that you'll continue to be in conversation with and carry forward. But we wanted to just use this as a moment to briefly think about Prairie Festival and about the different presentations and panels you've heard, the different experiences you've had in the Prairie and the research plots, and with Claire Pentecost exhibit and work. And we wanted to invite people to contribute questions, to stand and speak a question that not that we can answer or that you have an answer for, but a question that you could articulate and name for us that you are going to carry forward out of this festival about this work. So at this time, we just like to invite people to stand and name those questions for us that you can gift to all of us.
What would be a holistic Prairie Festival participant way to deal with elders and help them?
What would be a holistic Prairie Festival, ecospheric, I'll add that in, way to think about elders and their role in the work of healing going forward? Thank you. Sorry. Healthcare. Sorry, one more time?
When they need help.
When they need help.
Here's what I'd aim to just say. The road to my hell is paved with your good intentions.
Wow, the road to my hell is paved with your good intentions. Thank you.
How can I be a commoner, and how can I help others be a commoner?
Yeah. How can I be a commoner, and how can I help others be a commoner?
Mine's similar. How can I lose some of my ego and stop thinking about money and material things in favor of better values?
How can I lose some of my ego and stop thinking about money and material things and start thinking about better values?
How can we move forward from this strength of this community and use each of our own individual sphere of influence to both sit with the discomfort and breathe the future with joy?
Okay, you might have to help me on this one, but it's how can we move forward from this gathering, each calling upon our strengths and our spheres of influence.
To sit
Move
with
forward.
the feeling of discomfort and to bring those with us, and also to move forward. With
With
a sense of
a sense of joy. Yes. And teamwork is so part of that. Thank you for helping me with that one. It was a beautiful question.
Thank you, Karen.
How can we communicate our joys and our successes with each other?
How can we communicate our joys and our successes with each other in the future?
Are men allowed to speak?
Yes. Are men allowed to speak? What did I mean by the phrase more than human world?
What is the more than human world?
What is the kind of government that our country needs to form to deal with the future?
What is the kind of government our country needs to form to deal with the future? Sherry.
I think a question that ties a lot of this together is, how do we continue to bring young people into the Prairie Festival? I'm one of several people who've been bringing students here for many years, and they're usually back there in the bleachers. And on one hand, they say that they get the greatest conversations here. On the other hand, we don't hear them. So let's keep bringing them in and figure out ways to keep the young people coming here every year, because that's the joys and troubles that we want to share for the future. They're it.
So how do we bring the young people into the conversation and really hear from those of you who are in the bleachers in the back who might have questions and great ideas right now? Anyone?
How do we listen to the young? How do we bring principles of nature and fellowship into admittedly very flawed cycles of civilization and human nature?
How do we come to understand and live the notion that we are all related?
How do we teach the satisfactions of sufficiency in a society that celebrates acquisition?
How do we teach the satisfactions of sufficiency in a society that celebrates acquisition?
Thank you.
Oh yeah.
Oh, sorry. Where? Over where? Here.
Two more.
Okay.
One, two. How do we make this the homework? I see more hands than I wish we could call on everyone. What I would like to assign you as a teacher for your homework is to reach out to me and to the Land Institute and to Brooke at the Center for Humans and Nature with your questions. This is our work, and it is our work. And we would love to hear from your questions and to be able to feature them and to continue to explore them through both of our organizations. So please be in touch with us. Thank you all.
Thank you so much for doing this with us.